Oh, dear Rose, today we're going to be talking about belonging again, section 31. And we have already discussed this very significant problem on where society is structured in a manner where the very values that organize the society, like justice, freedom, come in opposition with givens and the social structure itself. And that would mean that at the heart of society is a kind of essential tension, an essential paradox that might begin to suggest why history repeats. Now, I think it is important to note that we can't simply say that one of the reasons this pluralism, globalization, and the destabilization of givens, we can't simply say that this is due to diversity, because diversity has always been with us. Yes, I think there's a way in which the interconnectability of the world through globalization has intensified the diversity, but we also want to be careful before we act like that diversity is new. We have Aquinas is interacting with Averroes. There's always been, New York has always been filled with different ethnic towns. Muhammad is a tradesman on the trade routes. And so civilizations have always dealt with the problem of difference. But today what seems different is that it's diversity plus a general skepticism about ultimate beliefs or the possibility of beliefs that are transcendentally grounded, say in a god or a religion. So that seems to be part of the issue, because if you're encountering diversity, but it doesn't make you question your ultimate beliefs or undermine the metaphysical principles by which you live your life, then the diversity is not a deep destabilization, it's more of a shallow destabilization. Whereas today, if you have the radical meeting of diversity that also shakes people's metaphysical frames, that's a deep diversity. That's a deep encounter with diversity that seems more existentially significant. Now, of course, this can be a chicken and egg problem, because which comes first? The diversity causes the shaking of the metaphysical principles, or the destabilization of the metaphysical principles, or does the shaking of the metaphysical principles change the meaning of diversity and thus makes diversity more existential? It's difficult to say. These things, it could be one way in one nation, another way the other nation. We have to avoid monotheism, as I like to say. But the point is that, but it would seem to be the case that the skepticism toward ultimate beliefs is changing the meaning of diversity and making existential anxiety more intense. Now, again, that may not be true, and again, diversity has always been with us, and surely with all of the racism, xenophobism, nationalism, colonialism that the world is full of, I'm not meaning to say that diversity has ever not been a source of discomfort and trouble, but it's curious to wonder why today diversity seems to be causing this radical destabilization of givens, and it might be because diversity plus the loss of metaphysical grounding. At the same time, I think the growth of the state, we've already talked about this with Conyers, the central government is also another contributing factor for why diversity is more existentially, is having this radical existential destabilization, this mass disenchantment of the world that Charles Taylor talks about in The Loss of Givens. It would seem the centralization of the state is also an important role of this. And one of the reasons the state grows and becomes more powerful is precisely so it can stop injustice. If people in their common lives are committing injustice, you want a strong state to stop it. And so justice can compel us toward greater and greater centralization. But when there's greater and greater centralization, then people know there's a power over them, and that destabilizes them as well. And when they know there's a lot of difference, then it's highly likely that different people will gain that power from you. It's likely different people will gain that power from you, and that's existentially destabilizing. And there's the knowledge that there's no metaphysical framework that could bind that power that is held in the hands of other people. And there's this knowledge that those other people are not metaphysically bound, say, by a belief in God. So all of that may intensify the existential anxiety that people feel. And if there's a strong central state, if you're a liberal and there's a conservative president who has the power to appoint supreme justices, you as a liberal can't know if abortion rights will be maintained, if LGBT marriage will be maintained, so there can be a destabilization there. And if you're a conservative and there's a liberal president, you don't know if religious organizations will keep their tax exemption. You don't know if new regulations will be imposed on business, and so on and so forth. When there's great power, everything feels possible. everything thus feels threatened. And this is not, say, the possibility of a Benjamin Fontaine, which is ontological and therefore can bring with it a kind of hope. This is a state possibility, which means it's power over us, as opposed to empowering us to escape whatever fate we may be thrown into. So this should not be confused with the possibility that Benjamin Fontaine talks about. But again, as it should be stressed, that the state tends to grow and becomes more powerful for just reason, and therefore to oppose state growth could be to contribute to injustice. And so the reason this existential instability arises is for just reason. All of this arises for just reason. And failure to accept it, or to learn to accept it, say by becoming delusional, could make us contribute to an injustice. Again, governments and societies must be able to change. If they are too rigid, they will fail and alienate their people, but if they are too fluid, they will do the same. Process, and this is a key idea, so like judicial processes, legal processes, all these business, social processes, all of these are necessary, and they're how a balance could be reached between, say, justice and freedom, structure and individual, so on and so forth. But if processes are done away with, as Peter Berger warns, with the loss of mediating structures, plausibility structures, all these different things, and there's not going to be processes. And in the paper, The War Between Process and Justice and the Death of Process, it's warned that justice and, say, the processes that help us determine justice are always in conflict. Because if, say, minorities are suffering injustice now, and there's a process that we have to go through to change the law to help the minorities, then that very process kind of extends and elongates the period of time in which minorities suffer. And so there's a sense in which justice kind of just demands, naturally in its own value, to just already be. And a process would be a gradual realization, and gradual realization of justice is contributing to an injustice. So process and justice and values in general always exist in a kind of conflict. Say a process to increase freedom exists in tension with the value of freedom, because the process is delaying the period of time in which freedom should already be realized. It's delaying the realization of freedom, and that can be, freedom won't like that. And you can go through all these different things. But the reason we need processes is because very often what we think will increase justice doesn't. What we think will increase freedom doesn't. So you need a process to make sure that ideas match actuality. So without a process, you just end up guessing, and the likelihood that you guess well, if all you have is process, is very low. But the very values of which process helps us realize are going to conflict with process, in the same way that the freedoms that givens make possible in a social order conflict with those givens, because givens restrict freedom. So you have all of these very strange paradoxical tensions that have to be worked out, that psychologically are very difficult to work out, and may not be tensions that can be worked out by anyone but Deleuzian individuals, overmen, and so absolute Noahs, all these different terms, which may be a state of being that only a minority can handle. And if that's the case, we have a problem. But anyway, process and justice are likely necessary opponents. A social conflict of mind, perhaps, where social responsibility comes in conflict with social possibility. We talk about in the book the conflict of mind, that a conflict of mind is where epistemic responsibility comes in conflict with epistemic possibility, where what we feel responsible to understand is beyond what it's possible for us to understand. Well, likewise, it would seem as if what we are socially responsible to support, say immediate justice, could come in conflict of what is socially possible, which would be a society that can arrive at justice without a process. And so responsibility and possibility could come in conflict, and that's quite bad. But it may be a necessary component of what it means to be human. The phenomenology of justice compels people against process, and yet process is necessary to keep existential anxiety from developing, so that authoritarianism doesn't become appealing. If there is no process by which justice is enacted, then people can question the justice that is enacted, because how do we know that it's just? If you don't vote for your leaders, how do you know that the leaders are a reflection of the will of the people? Voting creates legitimacy. Process creates legitimacy. So if you get rid of process, you can get rid of legitimacy, and yet values combat process. And that would mean values like justice, freedom, and so on combat the very processes that make those values legitimate. And that would suggest that there's something in values themselves that is self-effacing, that deconstruct themselves, because values combat the processes necessary to make those values legitimate. And so values work against, they naturally oppose their own legitimization, which suggests there's something self-effacing, almost suicidal in values, at least in a social sphere. So, if, say, justice naturally opposes the process of justice, that would, and likewise, there's a opposition against givens. Well, this could create, we've talked about this, an authoritarian backlash due to the increase of existential anxiety, the loss of process in givens could create. But that would function as evidence that indeed the society is unjust. I mean, look, there's an authoritarian backlash of conservatives, which could perhaps inspire liberals to think that they need to try harder to go around process and to create justice. And it should be noted that, say, if conservatives run the government and there are these processes that the government has to follow to change the society, those processes will be viewed by conservatives as bad, as standing in the way of the right thing to do, because whatever people believe, they naturally believe is the right thing to do. And so processes are always viewed negatively by those of whom the processes hold back. So there's an instability there. And if liberals are in power and there are processes that stop liberals from doing what they think they ought to do, then the processes will be viewed as bad. So process and values are always in a tension, just like givens and releases. And yet the processes are necessary for the legitimization of the values and the social order. But all of this suggests this very terrible tension. And if processes entail this tension, then it might just only be, then it would seem unlikely that process could help us escape history from repeating. And that's generally the question we are exploring. How do we escape from the cycles of history? As we've said, it's possible that there can be an individual transformation. That seems to be a good angle. But right here, we're exploring if there could be social processes, social systems that could help us escape it. And it would seem very unlikely or very difficult to imagine that. But so there's something about values that naturally opposes process, but it should be noted that process is required whenever we are dealing with trade-offs between competing goods or tragedies, because we cannot determine how to carry out the trade-off without a process. How do you know where to draw the line between justice and freedom, structure, and the individual? How do you determine that? Well, you need a process. So you need a process to determine how to balance values, how to trade them off, but the values will naturally oppose that process, and they'll come in conflict with that process. So the values of which need to be balanced are going to oppose the process by which that balance can be determined. And so there's another layer of instability that has to be addressed. And all of this would suggest why it's unlikely that process will succeed in finding these tragic trade-offs, and would suggest that it has to go to the individual level, which would suggest that everyone needs to become a Deleuzian individual, an absolute knower, a Nietzschean. But is that only possible for a minority? If so, we have a problem. And the section will also discuss how the Deleuzian individual is someone who has a certain way of thinking, they entail a certain kind of knowing, absolute knowing. And the paper is also going to discuss the section will discuss how skepticism is dead today, because we conflate skepticism with deconstruction and disbelief, where skepticism is deep thinking, or to ask questions of why the world is the way that it is and stuff like that. Well, if skepticism is conflated with deconstruction or being against, you're not going to be allowed to practice critical thinking, ways of absolute knowing, A-B thinking, of which are necessary to become Deleuzian individuals. So that moralization against skepticism in conflating it with deconstruction is going to contribute to our problem very much so, because if processes fail, people won't even have the new way of thinking necessary to fill the void, fill the gap left by the loss of those processes, and that will create a lot of trouble. But you see, there's also this tension where a reason why there's a way in which values themselves also oppose from us getting the ability to have deep philosophical reflection, for example. Because why do you need deep values? Are things you live and you act out. Why do you need to think about them? And in fact, the time you're taking to think about them, you're not living them out, so you're being immoral. The value of justice compels you not to think about justice, because as you think about justice, you're not enacting justice and you're not participating in justice, so you're contributing to injustice. So values also, in the same way that values are against process, we can think of thinking as a kind of process. Well, that would mean values are against learning new ways of thinking, but that would mean values are against us developing the thinking that is necessary for us to, say, become Deleuzian individuals so we can handle a world without process, which is exactly the kind of world that values might be leading us to. So there's this double action, this double problem that values may have, where values may work against the processes we need to organize our lives and to not develop the new ways of thinking that we need to survive if processes fail. So it's almost like there's a total damnation, a total undercutting that values can set us up for. It can destroy the processes we need, which, if you had those processes and you didn't have new ways of thinking, then you could still socially organize yourself because you'd have those processes. But if you lose those processes, you really need new ways of thinking because you need to fill in the void. Well, values might simultaneously take away both the processes and the new way of thinking, leaving us with absolutely nothing. And that's a major, major problem. And yet a society without values would be totalitarian and oppressive. If there's no values, if there's no justice and freedom, then that's horrible. That's a totalitarian regime. So you need values in order to have a society you want to live in, and yet the very presence of those values come in conflict with the processes that you need to maintain that social order and the new ways of thinking that might be necessary to handle the complicated paradoxical tragedy of the social order as a whole. To even be able to kind of take and accept this very strange tragedy that is a social order, this entire paradox of belonging again, this entire this very strange situation that is a social order, the very ability to handle it may require, or to think about it and to live with it and not let it drive you nuts, might require a new way of thinking, of which values work against you, of which values work against us developing. So values create the paradoxical situation, and they work against us getting the new way of thinking so that we can handle the paradoxical situation. And where does that leave us? It leaves us in a bind. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com. You can find the whole playlist on YouTube. You can find the list for all the sections on Medium, and thank you for your time.